Chapter 5 to 10. It was a lovely tournament, right up until Krillin's death. Gine had reluctantly allowed her son to talk her into going to watch him this time. A few hours before the tournament was to start, he turned up wearing nothing but a tiger skin and a bright grin. He had gained a few inches and quite a bit of muscle in the time since she had last seen him, and his usual whirlwind of activity and hurried stories had somehow ended up with her and Gohan perched behind him on the Nimbus. Master Roshi said I was supposed to go all around the world without using Nimbus so I could train, but I think we'll probably be late if we don't use it since you guys are too slow, he explained apologetically. Gine and Gohan shared an amused grimace at this, and didn't bother correcting him. Once they arrived and Kakarot had made rushed introductions, Gine spent a very pleasant few minutes getting to know people she had only ever heard about in stories, as well as getting reacquainted with Bulma. She and Gohan agreed to cover for Roshi as he went to disguise himself as Jackie Chun, and they all settled in to enjoy the tournament. The sheer variety of people she encountered in those brief hours astonished her. The info dump had not done this planet any justice. There was magic here, and psychic abilities, as well as far more strength than the average power level hinted at. Even so, humans were still humans. Bulma buried her face in Gine's shoulder upon seeing her boyfriend's leg broken, and it had actually taken Gine a few minutes to realize she was upset because of the injury, not because of the loss. Watching Tien turn away from the dark path of his master nearly brought her to tears, because it seemed as though while humans knew almost as much of brutality as Scions, it was also abundantly clear that they knew much more about change and forgiveness. By the time the tournament was over, Gine was exhausted. The intense succession of victories and defeats, as well as the sheer noise and mass of humanity after years of isolation, had taken its toll on her. Although she was glad she had come, she would be equally glad to return to her peaceful mountain home, once dinner was over, of course. As they made dinner plans, teasing Tien about his unknowingly foolhardy offer to feed 2 Scions, a cry rang out over the deserted tournament grounds, a sound that brought Gine straight back to her brief time serving in the combat corps. It was a sound unmistakable to anyone who had ever heard it before, the death cry of someone being brutally slaughtered. "That's Krillin!" Kakarot cried, running toward the sound. Gine's heart leapt into her throat as she followed him. Krillin was Kakarot's best friend, someone he had described to her often on his sporadic visits throughout the years. She had been delighted to meet him, and impressed at his strength during his fight with her son. She prayed she had been wrong about the nature of the sound. Everyone gathered in the back room of the tournament grounds, and it became clear immediately that Gine had not been mistaken. Kakarot was cradling Krillin's head in his arms, his tail bristling. The tournament announcer, injured and lying on the ground next to Krillin, babbled something about a monster having stolen a Dragon Ball and the tournament roster, but Gine was watching her son, his shoulders now shaking. "Krillin's dead," he murmured, his voice low and tight with shock. Gine realized this was the first time someone close to him had died, and her heart constricted in anguish for him. On Vegeta, this moment would likely have come much earlier in his life. Here on Earth, she had secretly been hoping it would never arrive. Kakarot stood up suddenly, growling deep in his throat. He grabbed his staff and turned to Bulma, eyes burning with rage. "Bulma! Do you have the dragon radar?" he demanded. Still in shock, all Bulma could do was pull the radar out of her pocket. Kakarot snatched it out of her grasp and ran out of the room. Roshi yelled for him to stop, but this shook Gine from her reverie and she turned to him. "Kakarot will be fine," she said. Roshi looked at her incredulously. "Are you insane? That thing took out Krillin. And Kakarot is coming off an exhausting tournament. He's going to get himself killed." "Hey, what's this thing?" Oolong said before Gine could reply, holding up a piece of paper. Bulma read it aloud. "It's the character, Ma, demon or sorcery, in a circle." Rashi's face went white, and he turned quickly, snatching the paper out of their grasp. He stared at it, haunted and trembling. "Do you know what this is?" Yamcha asked. Roshi looked up and met Gohan's eyes. "This is the seal of the great Demon King Piccolo," he said. Upon hearing this, Gohan's face went as white as his master's. "You don't mean the one that claimed the life of your master Mateto?" "The very same," Roshi said. "I've heard that name," Tien said. "He was a lord of demons said to have plunged the world into darkness many centuries ago. He was intent on killing every living thing in a reign of terror, but then he disappeared. No one seems to know what happened to him. Why is he here now?" "He shouldn't be," Roshi said. "My master sealed him away. He gave his own life to do it, and I buried the vessel on the ocean floor, never telling anyone where it was. I have no idea how Piccolo could have freed himself from that imprisonment. You mean you're saying Kakarot's gone off to fight a demon that almost destroyed the world? Yamcha asked, horrified. The little fool, Rashi muttered, shaking his head. If only I could have stopped him. All we can do now is pray. Keep your prayers, Gine said harshly. They were all acting like Kakarot was facing certain death. It's his right to try to avenge his friend. Are you saying you're not even worried about him? Tien demanded incredulously. It was one thing when you were watching the tournament and didn't bat an eye even though your son was fighting for his life. But now to allow him to run off after a known monster that has already killed without even a shred of concern. Don't you care about your son at all? Gine strode over to Tien and gathered up his collar in her fist, pulling his head down to her height. She pierced his gaze with her own, and, just for once in her life, reveled in the fact that she could blast this human into dust without even trying. Decades of being the weakest, of having to put up with horrible treatment just because she couldn't fight back, and then years of holding herself in, pulling her punches with Gohan because she didn't want to hurt him, all welled up in a rush of anger and frustration, and she let herself imagine, just for a moment, grinding this puny human's stupid face in until his brain squished out the other side of his skull. She was stronger than him by a large margin and she knew it, and in that moment, she could see that he knew it too. She released him. Kakarot and I are scions, she said, as Tien looked at her in surprise and not a little horror. We came here from another planet, the last two surviving members of a strong warrior race. My son will not be so easily killed, and neither will I. He will avenge his friend's death, and I will find this Demon King Piccolo and I will kill him. I will not let him bring my adopted home world to ruin. They were all staring at her now, everyone but Gohan seeming to realize for the first time that Kakarot had to have gotten his strength from somewhere. She cleared her throat and smoothed her hands down the front of her dress unnecessarily, then turned to address Bulma. If the monster took the Dragon Ball, then they must be looking for the others as well. Was the Dragon Radar you gave Kakarot the only one you have? Bulma stared at her slack-jawed for another few seconds, but then she shook herself and dashed the tears from her eyes. Yes, but I can make another one in about half a day. Would you start working on that, please? Gine asked politely. She didn't want her outburst to make them think differently of her. If we go looking for the Dragon Balls ourselves, then eventually we run into the Demon King. A fine plan, assuming you're strong enough to stand up to him, Rashi said sarcastically. You don't know how powerful the Demon King is. My master Mateto was many times stronger than I am now, and even he was no match for him. Begging your pardon, master, Gohan interjected, I don't think you need to worry about Gine here. If, as I suspect, my dear, you've been holding back on me all this time, you should stand a good chance of beating even him. Gine blushed, and nodded. Gohan chuckled. I thought so. I'm afraid I can't just take your word on this, Gohan, Rashi said, taking off his hat. My dear, if you really are as strong as all that, then you should be able to defeat me easily. Will you face me in battle? Are you idiots really going to fight over nothing when Krillin's laying here dead and Kakarot might be off dying too? Bulma shouted, and then burst into tears. Yamcha put an arm around her comfortingly and led her out of the room. Tien looked uncomfortable at the outburst, but he stepped closer to Rashi. Sir, I know I don't have the right to try to give you advice after everything I've done today, but I think you should trust her. She's... He shook his head, as though trying to clear it. If Kakarot grows up to be anything like her, then I was foolish to think well of myself for gaining a victory over him as a child. Rashi's eyes had not left Gine's. Thank you for the advice, everyone, he said coldly, but I've seen Demon King Piccolo for myself, and I will not trust his defeat to someone I haven't faced in battle. Gine gave him a slow nod. If you'll permit me, she said, I would prefer that no one else watch. Rashi gave her an answering nod, and the two of them walked outside, finding a sheltered spot on the now deserted tournament grounds. Rashi shed his suit jacket and tie until he was shirtless and lowered himself into a fighting stance. Gine took her own stance. Since this is merely about testing my strength, she said, and I don't want to hurt you, how about we put some limits on this? Not a problem, Rashi said. I think one exchange of blows should make things clear. In that case, why don't you go first? I admit, Rashi said, deepening his stance, something is telling me to take your word for it. You are certainly very sure of yourself. Just hit me, old man, Gine said flatly. Rashi gave a loud ki and came at her with a simple, straightforward punch that clearly had all his strength in it. If he had fought Tien like this, he might have won. Then again, he might have killed him in the process. Gine took the blow to her stomach with barely a gasp. Truthfully, it hurt quite a lot. But if there was one thing those years of abuse had given her, it was the ability to take a beating. She smiled, her lips curling up in an almost evil expression. "My turn," she said. Now that she had his full strength gauged, she knew exactly how much to hold back. She gave him an answering blow in the stomach, and he wheezed painfully as all the air was forcefully expelled from his abdomen. He folded over on her fist, and she gently lowered him to the ground. He was conscious, but only barely. "I'm sorry if that was a little much for you, old-timer," she said wryly. "But I did hold back as much as I could." Rashi gave a painful chuckle in reply. "You've convinced me," he whispered. "I will allow you to fight him. Not that I could do much to stop you, I see that now. But if you will permit me, I would feel much better if we had a safety measure in place." "That's fine," Gine said, kneeling down and putting Rashi's head on her knees. "Whatever makes you feel better. All I want is to protect my new home." "I'm going to ask you to keep this a secret," Rashi said, his voice still a whisper but sounding more and more as though it were a choice to speak softly. "Though I didn't want to admit it, I do know the technique my master used to seal the Demon King. But it cost him his life to use it." "You're saying you want to have that technique ready, just in case?" Gine asked. "That doesn't sound like you have much faith in me. If you had seen the depths of cruelty the Demon King could sink to, you would not be offended," Rashi said. His voice trembled, and not with the pain in his stomach. "Fine. But you won't get a chance to use it," Gine said, standing and helping Rashi to his feet. He smiled, and they shook hands. "I very much hope you are right, my dear." Gine stood facing the old Namekian, who she supposed might look a bit like a demon to a human that had never seen one before. She had never heard of an evil Namekian, but then, she doubted many people had heard of a scion who hated killing. Certainly his eyes held the kind of cruelty that was rare even among scions, eyes that spoke of someone who didn't just enjoy other people's suffering, but was nourished by it. In fact, she had seen eyes like that only one other time in her life, the one time she had ever come face to face with Frisia. Gine lowered herself into a stance. The Namekian laughed, a harsh barking sound that sent shivers down her spine. "What is this? I see two martial arts masters standing right behind you, woman, and yet you seek to take on the mighty King Piccolo yourself? Such foolishness I have never seen in all my days. Such cowardice on the part of those men back there. I might almost be insulted, except I plan on killing you all anyway. I suppose it doesn't matter in which order I do it. Let me clear up one thing for you," Gine said through her teeth. "Those men back there are human. I am a scion." The Namekian scoffed. "And what is that supposed to be? Some kind of vegetable? A woman is a woman, regardless of what else she is." Gine blinked in confusion for a moment, and then shook her head to clear it. So he didn't know what a scion was. All the better. That way it would come as a surprise. Without exchanging any further words, Gine launched herself at King Piccolo. She had time to savor the shock in his eyes before she slammed her fist straight into his face. He flew backwards several yards and landed heavily. She was on him before he could get up, landing an axe kick on his stomach and then wedging her foot underneath his prone body to kick him up into the air, where she kicked him back down to earth again. Namekians didn't have bones quite the same way scions and humans did, so there was no satisfying crack of them breaking as she gave him blow after blow. But it was clear nonetheless that he was suffering, and a part of her, buried deep, drank in the sight like water. The rest of her found being the cause of someone else's pain completely distasteful, and she stepped back for a moment, centering herself and deciding to simply end him in one last blow. "Scion." The Namekian was whispering, somehow still conscious. He was looking at her as though trying to figure something out. Her tail lashed behind her in irritation, and she drew back a fist, ready to fire an energy blast strong enough to disintegrate him. "That tail, the boy." Gine froze. "What boy? What are you talking about?" King Piccolo chuckled, a wet sound due to all the blood in his mouth. He pulled himself slowly to his feet, not nearly as injured as Gine had assumed he was. "I see now," he said. "It all makes sense. You must be his mother, I take it. I can see the family resemblance now that I know to look for it." "What are you talking about?" Gine growled, starting to lose her composure. "Oh, just reminiscing about a little boy I killed earlier," King Piccolo said airily. Gine considered this for a moment, and then barked out a bitter laugh. "You? Kill Kakarot? You must think I'm really stupid." But the Namekian merely smiled. Go on. Try and sense his energy. I know you must be able to, as strong as you are. Confidently at first, but then with growing panic, Gine reached out with her senses to try to find the bright spot that was her son. He was never usually hard to find. From time to time in his travels she would reach out just to see how he was doing. There was no one else on this planet whose flame burned quite as brightly as his, or in quite the same way, and being able to sense him even all the way across the planet was comforting. But this time she couldn't find him. It wasn't like the times she reached out and his energy was faint. She could always tell he was merely hungry, injured or sleeping. This time he simply wasn't there. All across the planet burned the dim little dots of the mass of humanity, interrupted here and there by the slightly brighter spots of martial arts masters and very strong humans. But there was no pillar of flame that stood out like a tree amongst grass. No familiar bright, happy, laughing energy that felt like pure joy. Nothing. And its absence tore a hole through Gine's heart. Without warning she felt a fist slam into her face, and she staggered back. Before she could collect herself, Piccolo was landing blow after blow, fast enough that in her distracted state, all she could do was ineffectively block and simply try to endure the blows. She knew if she could just get one good hit on him he was dead, but he wasn't giving her any openings big enough for her to exploit with only half her attention. Soon he seemed to realize that mere punches were going to take too long to wear her down, and he planted a foot in her chest and kicked her hard enough to send her flying. She immediately leapt to her feet, hoping this was the opening she had been looking for, but it turned out he had merely been giving himself space to start utilizing some kind of energy attack that came from his eyes. One of them hit her in the meat of her arm and she roared in pain. The attacks weren't particularly powerful, but they were sharp and focused, and she couldn't simply endure them the way she could his punches. Now completely on the defensive, she could only try to dodge the piercing eye beams, and before long her dress was dotted with holes. He was speaking, saying something about her son and how easily he had died, and in a flash of insight Gine realized she was going to lose. Most scions used anger as a source for their power, but anger had only ever made her weak and confused. Her grief and rage over Kakarot's death would not help her now. And on the other hand, Gohan's teachings relied on a calm heart and a clear mind, but she had only ever given the idea lip service. It was easy enough to stay calm while living isolated in the woods, but she had never expected to find herself in a real fight ever again. Facing a foe that, while in terms of sheer power was beneath her, had her beat through superior experience and skill, was teaching her a lesson she wasn't sure she would survive long enough to learn. Briefly the assault let up, and she tried desperately to bring enough power to bear to blast him away in the seconds she had to breathe, but he was already powering up an enormous energy attack of his own, and she knew this was a race she could not win. All she could do was cross her arms in front of her and try to brace for impact as best she could. But the impact never came. Instead, there was a sudden release of pressure as the energy Piccolo had been building dissipated all at once. She opened her eyes and caught a brief glimpse of some kind of swirling green vortex, the stretched-out specter of King Piccolo in the middle of it. She turned around and watched as Master Roshi directed the swirl of energy with his hands, guiding it to slam down into an electric rice cooker, which Gohan quickly closed. Roshi collapsed, and Gohan and Gine both ran to him. "It's done," Roshi was gasping, as Gohan gave him energy. He met Gine's eyes and added, "You sure showed me. I feel pretty silly for doubting you now." Gine could only shake her head. Exhausted, she fell to her knees, and then, sensing that Gohan was about to echo Roshi's sentiments, she bowed herself to the ground and spoke to him first. "I owe you an apology," she said to the ground. "I've never taken your training seriously. I only ever saw it as a game, and I understand now how incredibly foolish that was. Please accept my apology." Now, Gohan said, sounding embarrassed. "There's no need for all that. You had no good reason to take it seriously. By rights you should never have met someone on this planet who would even be able to stand up to you." "That's exactly the problem," Gine said, not lifting up her head. "I've told you about Frisia. Do you remember?" "Well, yes, but we figured it would be highly unlikely for him to ever come here, right? And how likely did any of you think it would be for the Demon King to rise again?" Gine said harshly. "I've been so happy here, I've gotten incredibly complacent. I assumed things would simply go on as they had forever, and that unwillingness to face reality has now cost my son his life." Gine was unable to continue speaking through the tears that swelled her throat. She felt Gohan's comforting hand on her shoulder. There, my dear. We have almost all the Dragon Balls. We'll simply find the remaining ones and wish him and the others back to life. It's possible Frisia may never come here and you're worrying for nothing. You helped us achieve a great victory today, Gine, and you should be proud of that. The Dragon Balls. Rashi said, laboring to stand up. He had the last two. Where are they now? Gohan pulled out the dragon radar, and the other two crowded around him to look. They should be right around here, he said, puzzled. Gine looked up at the airship that was still hovering over them. As they watched, it began to slowly fly away. With a growl, Gine launched herself into the air and landed on the deck of the airship. A small blue creature with large ears gave a loud shriek and scuttled backwards, tripping over the corpse of some kind of pterodactyl. Gine strode over to him and picked him up by his collar. Where are the other two Dragon Balls? She demanded. He gibbered and bluffed, and she shook him. I am not a patient woman. Tell me where they are. My. Your lord needs you, the small blue man screamed. A woman in a trench coat holding a minigun emerged from the control room, and Gine pointed a finger at the gun and blasted it out of her fingers. She brought her face in closer to the small man's and growled. Dragon Balls. Now. Dee-dee-doo, as the nice woman says, my. Reluctantly, the woman took two Dragon Balls out of her coat pocket and handed them over. Gine, recalling herself, set the little blue man down on the deck gently. Thank you very much for your cooperation, she said calmly, before leaping off the side of the airship. Pilaf stood where she had set him, still shaking in shock. Before Mike could ask after his well-being, his body slowly tilted backwards until he fell to the ground. My lord. Mai yelled, gathering up her emperor and shaking him slightly. Are you alright? He moaned. Make a note for the official record, Mai, he said faintly. From now on, no matter what's at stake, we leave anyone with a tail the hell alone. Gine landed delicately next to Gohan, handing him the last two Dragon Balls. She watched with numb detachment as he summoned the dragon, but before he could speak their wish, a familiar sound jolted through her ears, sending her heart into a gallop. Her eyes snapped up of their own accord to see Kakarot riding the Nimbus toward them at great speed, waving and laughing. Before she could fully process what she was seeing, he had already jumped down and flung himself into her arms. Ma, he shouted. You're all right. Thank goodness. That's my line, young man. Gine scolded, holding him out at arm's length. His clothing was ruined, but other than that he looked totally fine. Relief squeezed her heart so hard it turned into rage, leaving her limbs weak and pricking her eyes with hot tears. Had Piccolo tricked her? Or, worse, had her own mind been tricking her? Had she overestimated her abilities and simply been unable to sense him even though he was there? Too many emotions warred for dominance and she shook her son hard, screaming at him even as she wanted to fold him in her arms and never let go. What happened to you? I couldn't sense your energy anywhere. I thought you were dead. I almost was, Kakarot said offhandedly, his only concession to the shaking being to grasp her wrists to stabilize himself. His total lack of concern at her anger had never infuriated her more than it did now. But that's not important. Corinne told me you defeated King Piccolo. Is that really true? Gine's righteous fury faltered. Well, She sure did. Rashi said, stepping forward. It was incredible. I've never seen fighting like that in all my life. Kakarot stared at her in wonder, and Gine felt the rage give one last stab through her body and then ebb away. She didn't know why Rashi was being so kind. She hadn't defeated Piccolo. He and Gohan had had to seal him away because she had gotten distracted. Her son was alive, but through no effort of hers. She didn't deserve their praise, and she most certainly did not deserve the awe she saw growing in her son's eyes. If it weren't for your mother, we all very likely would have been killed, Gohan said, coming up to join them. Gine flashed him a warning look that he ignored. Kakarot, still dangling from her arms, opened his mouth to speak, but they were all interrupted by the dragon clearing its throat. I grow impatient. Speak your wish now. The flurry of activity that followed put the conversation permanently on hold. They wished back everyone who had been killed by King Piccolo and his children, and then traveled to Kame House to check on everyone there and fill them in on what happened. Rashi, Gohan, and Kakarot all filed through the door, greeted with shouts of joy from inside, but Gine couldn't bring herself to even step onto the porch. She could hear them in there, recounting the battle they insisted on calling her victory, and her shame made it impossible for her to face their gratitude. Kakarot came out to join her after a few minutes, now wearing his staff, and he took her by the hand and led her over to the Nimbus. She climbed on, almost in a daze, and Nimbus took off. Every so often Kakarot would turn back to look at her, as though checking to make sure she was still there. She smiled back whenever he did, still just happy he was alive and with her, but for most of the flight she was frowning, deep in thought. Complacency. That was the problem. She had allowed complacency to creep into her heart and it had nearly cost her everything. Gine had wanted to be a fighter for about as long as it took her to get in her first fight, at which point it had become abundantly clear to everyone, herself most of all, that Gine was not a proper scion and never would be. Being forced to come to Earth had turned out to be a blessing in disguise, for although she mourned her people, she had found fulfillment and happiness here on this alien world full of beings that were pretty much the opposite of scions, weak and senselessly kind. And then when these weak beings had been threatened, when it had been up to her to protect them and repay them for everything they had done for her, she had been unable to. Worse, for once in her life her power level hadn't been the deciding factor. If she'd managed to hold on to even a tiny fraction of the scion killing instinct she had always shied away from, she would have done away with the Namekian in seconds. Instead, she had allowed him to get inside her head and destroy her confidence, and she hadn't been strong enough to withstand his superior skill on top of the mental onslaught. This particular threat had now been neutralized, no thanks to her, but next time. And it would be foolish to think there wouldn't be a next time. Even if Frisia never came here, Kakarot had told her of several power-hungry Earthlings he had dispatched. What if one of them somehow grew powerful enough to challenge a scion, or use technology to bridge the gap? Earthlings were weak creatures, but they were wily beyond anything Gine had imagined, and some of them were as bloodthirsty as scions. She thought briefly of the peaceful life in the mountains she had led, engaging no foes more vicious than deer trying to eat her rhubarb, and knew, though she didn't want to admit it, that those carefree days were over. Suddenly she noticed they were flying in the wrong direction to be going back to the mountain. Where are we going, Kakarot? Kakarot spun around on the cloud, looking at her eagerly. I'm taking you to Corin's tower. I want you to teach me everything you know, and then he'll teach us everything he knows, and then I'll teach you the Kamehameha. I had no idea you were so strong, Ma. If I'd known that I would have taken you to Corin's earlier. Gine had only a vague idea who Corin was. Her son related events in order of interest, not chronologically, and he left many things out entirely. For instance, until the day before she had assumed Launch was merely two sisters and Kakarot had forgotten one of their names. Unless she was mistaken, which was very possible, Corin was some kind of con artist, or possibly a healer. Considering she had only ever heard of him through the lens of Kakarot's storytelling, he was just as likely to turn out to be a cat. Still, Gine couldn't quite bring herself to tell her son to simply take her home. She reached out and stroked his hair, and he leaned back into the motion, and for just a moment he was her little baby boy again. She knew it was an illusion, but she couldn't help but hold on to it even so. Perhaps this was one of the reasons why scion mothers didn't grow attached to their young. Allowing herself to love him and then let him leave had turned out to be a sweet kind of pain that only grew harder to bear after nearly losing him for good. Soon they came to a large tower that stretched far into the sky, and it turned out Corin was indeed a cat, and a martial arts master to boot. He also seemed able to read minds, and he gave Gine a knowing wink when Kakarot requested that he train them. Sorry, pal, you lot are stronger than I know what to do with. You're going to have to speak to a higher power if you want someone to train you now. A higher power? Kakarot repeated. That staff you got there ain't just for beating people with, you know. It was originally the thing that connected this tower with the sanctuary that floats high above it. The sanctuary that houses God. Gine tried not to giggle, she really did. It was hard to take him seriously when, not only was he speaking of deity as though it existed, but he was also, well, a cat. The cat gave her a sour look. Kakarot merely looked confused. What are you talking about? It'll be easier if you just go up there and see for yourself, Corin said. Both of you are so strong that God is the only one who can train you now. If the Earthlings thought a Namekian was a demon, there was no telling what their god might turn out to be. In spite of herself, Gine grew curious. Okay. Kakarot sang out happily. How do we meet this god guy? Corin pointed heavenward. Simply place your staff in the sconce on the very top of this tower and extend it all the way up. And take this bell as proof that you come with my blessing. Kakarot took the bell and did as instructed, Gine following, bemused. Before Kakarot made the staff extend, however, Corin had one last piece of advice for them that sobered her considerably. Oh, and when you get up there, don't worry. Your eyes aren't playing tricks on you, but remember, neither am I. Corin's words fell into place the moment she saw Cammy's face. He was waiting for them, standing next to a rotund person in a turban, but both she and her son only had eyes for the tall green man who looked exactly like King Piccolo. "Greetings," he said, but was able to get out no more than that before Kakarot shouted ferociously and leaped forward. Gine had just enough presence of mind to grab him by the tail and yank him back. "Who are you?" she demanded, holding her son upside down by his tail. Corinne's assurances notwithstanding, if his answer wasn't satisfactory she would let her son go and join him in battle. "I am Cammy," the Namekian said, and Gine could see that his eyes held no cruelty. "I suppose I can't blame you for mistaking me for Piccolo, but I assure you we are two separate beings, though this was not always the case. Long ago, he and I were one. In order to become Cammy I had to expel all the evil from my heart, and that evil became Piccolo. This has long been my shame, and in gratitude to you for defeating him, I will grant you any request." Kakarot finally squirmed out of Gine's grip and landed lightly on his feet. "I want to train with you." It was as though his previous aggression had been totally forgotten. Gine had time to smile at his innocence before he pointed at her and added, "And so does my ma." The smile fell from her face, and she opened her mouth to say, "Well, something," but before she could, Cammy nodded, stroking his chin. "I see," he said. "Very well." Kakarot danced around, delighted, and Gine tried to think of some way to politely decline. Cammy caught her gaze and gave her a knowing look, and although his face was kind, it also put her in mind of his evil counterpart. His horrible laughter echoed in her ears, and she swallowed down her objections. Next time she wouldn't flounder. Next time she would be ready, and if that meant training with this old Namekian, so be it. Kakarot looked up at her with an expression of such pure joy that it was impossible not to answer it with a smile of her own. Gine sat at the edge of the lookout, staring at the growing sliver of pink at the edge of the sky, Kakarot's sleeping head on her lap, and felt Cammy come to stand next to her. "It was the right thing to do," he said, and Gine slowly shook her head. "I know that, but he and I are the only two left. I'm the only scion alive who remembers our culture, so anything I choose not to pass on won't get passed on, period. It feels like I'm killing them all over again every time I don't tell him something. I know I've been raising him as an earthling all this time, so it shouldn't matter now, but this feels like I've crossed some line I can't uncross." Cammy shifted slightly. "But his tail has grown back before, yes?" "It won't this time," Gine said flatly. "He's too old and there's too much scar tissue. He'll never be an Oozuru again." She buried her face in her hands. Cammy put a hand on her shoulder, and he kept it there until the sun rose. "Ma, my butt hurts." Gine looked down at her son, who in turn looked up at her. His eyes were red and his hair even more mussed than normal. His voice was hoarse and there was a faint question in his eyes. "Lay on your side, then," she said reasonably. He complied. "What happened?" he asked after he was comfortable. "You went Oozuru and we had to cut off your tail," she said bluntly. Kakarot was silent for a moment as he digested this. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know I'm real bad about looking at the moon when I shouldn't." "That's okay," Gine said, although she didn't quite mean it. "It won't grow back this time." "Oh, that's good then," Kakarot said, his easygoing acceptance piercing her heart like an arrow. "I guess I get real strong when that happens, but since I don't remember it sort of feels like cheating. Plus I just make a big mess anyway." It was all true, but not one bit of it made Gine feel any better. She stroked her fingers through his hair for a few minutes, and then he spoke again. "Ma, you've gone Oozuru before, right? How did you keep from making a big mess?" Gine tilted her head back and looked up at the fading stars. On planet Vegeta the moon came full only once a year. In her girlhood, there had been a planet-wide festival to celebrate it, a 24-hour period during which everyone except the extremely old took the great ape form. It was a time of drinking and feasting, and, off in the mountains away from young ones, orgies and couplings. Many children were born after the festival to unknown parentage, and Gine herself had been one of these. She felt that made it extra ironic that the festival was her least favorite time of year, and she avoided participating whenever possible. Still, being forced to take the form once a year had allowed her to gain what little control over it she had. There was always that one guy who destroyed some important building or killed someone he shouldn't have on the festival night and woke up the next morning with egg on his face, and at the very least she could say she had never been that guy. "Practice," she said. Kakarot was silent for another few minutes, and Gine took the moment, the sky smeared with the pinks and oranges of sunrise, her son's hair in her fingers, his head a welcome weight on her lap, and pressed it into her memory like a flower between the pages of a book. she knew she would not have another moment like it again. Kakarot was starting to shed his baby fat, and he was already several inches taller than he had been when they arrived at the lookout. Soon he would be physically mature, and her little baby boy would be gone. For so long she had been waiting for that day, and now that it was imminent she wanted to delay it as long as she could. She wondered if he would still look like Bardock once he was grown. She wondered if she wanted him to. "Ma," Kakarot said sleepily. She glanced down, surprised to find him falling asleep again. "How come you never told me you were so strong?" "I'm not. Every scion I've ever known was stronger than me, and you probably will be too, but both of us are so much stronger than every other earthling we will ever meet. Strength is not the metric I wanted you to use to judge people. Besides, I was enjoying pretending to be an earthling too much. Would I have kept the secret if I had known how much fun it would be sparring with you, son? I never did quite believe Gohan when he told me I could fight without being a bloodthirsty monster, find joy in the fight without finding joy in the violence, but somehow you found that balance, and now you're showing it to me. Is this what it means to be a scion raised as an earthling?" "It never came up," she said, and somehow he accepted it. It was raining on the day of the 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai. Despite the weather the grounds were packed with people, including Gine and Kakarot. "Do you see M yet, Ma?" Kakarot asked, tipping up on his toes to look over heads. "I can't wait to show M how much I've grown." Gine smiled and followed more sedately, twirling a straw umbrella in her hands. It had only been 3 years, but it felt like an entire lifetime since she had seen their old friends. The prospect of seeing them now gave her slight butterflies, but the calm heart she had cultivated on Cammy's lookout quelled her nerves and she could look forward to seeing them with more enjoyment than anxiety. "Oh. There they are." Kakarot grabbed her arm and dragged her through the crowd until they came to a stop in front of Rashi, Grandpa Gohan, Bulma, and Launch. "Wow, you guys look great." "Who?" Bulma began, but then spotted Gine behind Kakarot, and her mouth dropped open. Her eyes ping-ponged between them in disbelief. "No way. You're not little Kakarot." "Not so little, but definitely still Kakarot," Gine confirmed as her son grinned ear to ear. She and Bulma leaned in for a quick hug. "It's good to see you, dear. Where's Yamcha?" Bulma rolled her eyes. "As soon as he heard you guys were up training with Cammy, he left on some trip to go train in the desert. I haven't seen him since, and good riddance." Bulma turned up her nose, but Gine could tell her indifference was mostly an act. She smiled indulgently, and turned to see Gohan chatting with Kakarot. The old man saw her and a wide grin broke out over his face. "Gine. It's been so long. How have you been, my dear?" They embraced. "I see Kakarot has finally become a man," he said. "He's as tall as one," Gine said with an affectionate eye roll. "You're going to be amazed at his strength. He intends to enter the tournament, but I don't really know what for." "You should enter too, Ma," Kakarot said, turning from where he was showing off his height to Rashi and Bulma. "We could fight each other in the final match." Gine shook her head. "I'll leave the fun and games to you, son," she said. "Oh, you think it will be that easy, do you?" said a familiar voice. They turned to find Tien, accompanied by Kaiotsu, Yamcha, and Krillin, all road-weary but smiling. Tien stepped forward and bowed to Gine. "Ma'am, I would be honored if you would enter. I've gotten a lot stronger since the last time we met, and I'm eager to test my skills against you." "I can see that," Gine said, using the insight she had developed while training with Cammy to perceive what Tien was capable of. For an earthling it was truly impressive. Apparently he'd taken their last interaction as a challenge. "So have I, but I didn't gain this strength to use it to win a tournament." "Ah, Ma, don't make it sound like I'm being selfish," Kakarot whined. "I just want to see how strong everyone's gotten." "There's nothing wrong with you entering, Kakarot," Gine said mildly. "I just don't want to, that's all." She could see Tien hiding his disappointment, but she knew he'd be even more disappointed if they fought. "It's not fair." Krillin wailed, looking up at Kakarot's new height. "No offense, ma'am, but I was starting to think the males of your species were just smaller than the women. There's no way I can catch up to that." Everyone laughed, and into this merriment 2 more people entered, one of them considerably taller than even Kakarot. "My word!" Gohan exclaimed. "Ox King. Is that you?" "It sure is, Gohan," the Ox King boomed. "Long time no see." The 2 men began to catch up, and the other figure, who had been standing in Ox King's shadow, stepped forward, coming to rest with a bounce immediately in front of Kakarot. She was a beautiful young woman, and her long black hair and large black eyes made her look, to Gine at least, almost scion. Kakarot, she said, peering behind him at Gine. Is that your ma? Yeah, but who are you? Kakarot said, puzzled. The young woman reared back and glared at him. Who do you think, dummy? That's my pa back there. Ox King's your. Wait, Chi-Chi. Kakarot gaped at the young woman before him. But you were a little girl. And you were a little boy, she snapped. And it looks like you still are. Next you'll be tellin' me you forgot your promise. Chi-Chi's eyes immediately blazed with anger. Are you tellin' me you forgot you promised to marry me? I did. Gine, who knew her son could be forgetful, but not that forgetful, watched the exchange with breathless anticipation. So did everyone else. You said you'd come back and ask my father for my hand. Are you saying you don't remember that? I did say something like that, I guess, Kakarot admitted, scratching his head. What does that mean, to ask for someone's hand? I don't want no body parts. I ain't that kinda guy. Gine snorted before she could help herself. Krillin put a hand over his mouth to hide his giggles, and Bulma, arm already hooked into Yamcha's, rolled her eyes. Kakarot turned to his mother with a helpless look, but Gine was not about to bail him out. She raised a meaningful eyebrow, and eventually he turned back to Chi-Chi. You're sayin' we gotta get married, 'cause I wanted your hand? Gotta. Chi-Chi spluttered indignantly. Well, if marrying me would be such a hardship, then maybe you should just forget it. Chi-Chi thrust her nose up in the air and turned her back on Kakarot, addressing Gine instead. Ma'am, may I present to you my father, the Ox King? The girl couldn't have been more than 110 pounds soaking wet, so Gine was impressed to see her take her giant father by the arm and drag him to the fore. Oddly, there was a blush flaming on his cheeks, but the reason for it became clear when Kakarot chose that exact moment to lean over and whisper in Gine's ear. Ma, remember, he's single. Gine elbowed her son hard in the kidney. I'm aware of that, Kakarot. You bring it up every time you mention him. I'll just leave you two to get acquainted, Chi-Chi said with a suggestive smile, taking Kakarot by the arm and leading him away, already berating him again. Ox King scratched his head, smiling nervously. It seems my girl is set on marrying your boy, he said. He seems like a nice feller, I wouldn't mind having him as a son-in-law. Gine glanced at their two children. Chi-Chi was yelling at Kakarot, her voice carrying easily despite being some distance away. Kakarot was just standing there taking it, slowly rubbing the back of his head with one hand. Gine had lectured her son more times than she could count, but he'd never once reacted to her with sheepishness. The pity she had sometimes felt for her future daughter-in-law, assuming Kakarot could, or even wanted to, get himself a wife, seemed silly now. Gine smiled. The feeling is mutual, she said. Ma, the baby's comin'. Gine looked up from where she was weeding the garden to see Kakarot running full pelt toward her, looking more scared and panicked than she had ever seen him look in his life. She stood abruptly and he took one last leap over her plants and landed in front of her, plowing up a small scar in the earth in his haste. What the hell do you mean, the baby's coming? She demanded, even as he grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the house. It's already here, inside your wife's stomach, you idiot. We've told you that over and over. I dunno. Kakarot shrieked. Alls I know is Chi-Chi's hittin' real bad and she says the baby's comin'. That wasn't good. Scions usually had easy pregnancies, but the doctors had made sure to tell her that if she ever started to hurt she should come see them, because that meant something was very wrong. Gine had made it to both birth appointments without experiencing any pain whatsoever, but she had heard of women who got really sick because the baby had gone wrong and died inside them. When Kakarot flung the door off its hinges and dragged her to the bedroom to see bloody sheets and Chi-Chi doubled over and screaming, Gine wasted no time. She scooped her daughter-in-law up in her arms and made it as far as the front door before Gohan flung himself in front of her, arms wide. Put her down, my dear, he said sternly. She needs to stay in bed. She needs to go to the hospital. Gine shouted, a redness creeping into the edges of her vision. She loved Gohan like the father she had never known, but she would knock his head off his shoulders if he continued to stand in her way. Ma, for heaven's sakes, put me down, Chi-Chi grunted, breathing heavily. This is really uncomfortable. She groaned and squeezed her eyes shut, gripping Gine's arms so tightly it almost hurt. You're hurting and you're bleeding, Gine said urgently, trying to dance around Gohan in the doorway. That means you need a doctor. The midwife's already on her way, Ox King said, as infuriatingly calm as Gohan. Gramps, can't you see she's hutton? Kakarot pled with Gohan. Put me down this instant, or so help me, Chi-Chi roared, but before she could finish the sentence another wave of pain shuddered through her and she stuffed the collar of her nightgown into her mouth and screamed. We need to wait for the midwife, Gohan was telling Kakarot. Gine finally hooked her ankle around the old man's leg and dropped him to the floor, striding out into the yard with her daughter-in-law in her arms, and was in the act of bending her knees to take to the sky before she noticed the person standing on the path just outside the house. Here I am, the wizened old woman said calmly. My, you young people can be so impatient. It turned out that while Earth babies could be removed surgically, usually they simply came out the way they went in. And, yes, a little blood and a lot of pain was completely normal. Chi-Chi had a strong body and wide hips, and the baby was positioned correctly, so there was no reason to think this would be anything other than textbook. The midwife, a sweet old woman with sure hands and a wealth of knowledge, explained everything to her with godlike patience as she coaxed her into putting Chi-Chi back down on the bed, and Gine swallowed down her horror the best she could during this swift education. The thought that her ancestors had likely undergone this same process before Regan tanks came into widespread use made her wonder why there were any scions left at all. She had no time for this kind of pondering, however, as the only one Chi-Chi wanted in the room while she labored besides the midwife was Gine. Gine had no idea why. Apparently she knew less about how birth worked than Grandpa Gohan. The unworried fashion in which the midwife bustled around the house, preparing this or that and checking on Chi-Chi periodically, made her feel mightily stupid, and she wasn't very much enjoying being forced to listen to her daughter-in-law's agony while not being allowed to do anything about it. On second thought, this arrangement was probably for the best. Kakarot had been taken out into the woods by his grandfather, and Gine thought if the poor boy were here to hear his mate's screams he might well lose it. Gine wondered silently, as the hours went on and nothing seemed to change, if any baby could possibly be worth this. Did it matter how cute the thing might be if she was just going to look at it and remember the screams and the blood that had resulted in it? She knew there was no room left in her heart for babies, anyway. What little space Kakarot didn't take up was reserved for a child she would never see again. This little half-human thing, probably a sterile hybrid if it was even healthy, couldn't possibly compare. Chi-Chi gave one last, deep groan and the midwife leaned forward, her deeply wrinkled face furrowed even deeper in concentration. A minute later tiny lungs inflated for the first time and a high-pitched wailing filled the room. Gine found herself back in time, standing over a scion pod, steeling herself to send her child out into the universe to face an unknown fate by himself. He was crying. The baby was crying, yelling as though his little heart would break, and she could not make herself turn away. It's a boy, the midwife announced proudly. Ah, Chi-Chi sighed, leaning back on the pillows. The noise was mostly one of relief, although oddly it held a slight note of disappointment. Were you hoping for a girl? The midwife asked kindly, busy with the infant, doing things Gine couldn't see. Chi-Chi lolled her head over to look at her mother-in-law, eyes bright with exhaustion. I was hoping to name him after you, she said. Something inside Gine's chest expanded nearly to bursting, leaving her choked and breathless, her eyes stinging with tears. The midwife handed a small bundle of blankets to Chi-Chi, and both women looked down at the tiny babe, squalling with displeasure and utterly beautiful. Did you have a name picked out for a boy? The midwife asked. Neither woman took their eyes from the child. No, Chi-Chi said. I was convinced it was going to be a girl. I was named after my grandmother and I wanted this little one to be too. Don't tell my pa, but I don't exactly want to name a boy after him. Gine chuckled. She and the Ox King had bonded over their love for their children, as well as amusement at said children's early efforts to play matchmaker, but she didn't think his name was really suitable for passing on either. She reached out and placed the tip of her forefinger into the baby's palm, and he clutched it with all his strength. What about naming him after Gohan? She said, and she could see Chi-Chi smile out of the corner of her eye. Gohan, she said, testing it out. That's perfect. If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.